"Excuse me, sir. I didn't know anyone was in the room. I'll come back later. Dad, don't look at me like that. 20 years. 20 years and you couldn't pick up a phone. You weren't supposed to find me here. You weren't supposed to find me at all." Christopher Vance stepped off his private jet on a cold March morning expecting to deliver the most important keynote of his career. Instead, 6 hours later, he would walk into a hotel suite on the 42nd floor of the Westmark Charlotte and find his 71-year-old father pushing a vacuum across the carpet, wearing a gray maintenance uniform with the name Edward stitched in faded thread above the chest pocket. For 40 long seconds, neither man would speak. And when his father finally did, the apology that came out of his mouth would unravel 20 years of silence, 2 failed marriages, 1 cross-continental escape, and a fintech empire built on the assumption that Edward Vance was either dead or didn't deserve to be alive. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional family dramas and the kind of twists that change everything you thought you knew, please tap that like button and subscribe so you never miss a story. And before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. 20 years earlier, Christopher had walked out of his family's foreclosed home in suburban Raleigh with 2 suitcases and a one-way bus ticket to Singapore. He was 23 years old. He had a finance degree he had paid for himself, a job offer at a small payment startup that would later become enormous, and a chest full of resentment so heavy he could barely close the zipper on his luggage. His father had stood on the front lawn, hands at his sides, watching him leave. Edward Vance had not chased him, had not begged, had not even raised his voice. He had simply nodded once, as though accepting a sentence he had been expecting for a long time. Christopher had not looked back. The business venture that had destroyed the family was called Vance and Hadley Logistics. Christopher had been 17 when it collapsed. He remembered the night the men in suits came to the house. He remembered his mother sitting at the kitchen table holding her wedding ring in her palm, deciding whether to sell it. He remembered the for sale sign in the front yard, the auction tags on the furniture, the way his father had stopped shaving and started staring at the wall. Within 18 months of the bankruptcy, his mother was dead from what the death certificate called complications of pneumonia. Christopher had always called it something else. He had called it Edward's fault. In Singapore, he had become someone new. Within 6 years, he was a vice president. Within 10, he had launched his own platform, a cross-border payment system that ate market share from older banks the way fire eats dry grass. By 40, he was on magazine covers. By 43, he had been featured in a Bloomberg documentary. He owned an apartment in Sentosa Cove, a place in London, a holiday house in Queenstown. He had not been back to the United States in 19 years. The invitation to deliver the closing keynote at FinTechX had arrived in November. He had refused twice. Then his head of communications had reminded him that the conference was the largest gathering of payment executives in North America, that his largest competitor would be in the audience, and that refusing would look like weakness. So he had agreed. He had told himself it was business. He had told himself Charlotte was just a city. He had told himself his father was a stranger who happened to share his last name. The jet touched down at Charlotte Douglas just after 4 in the morning. Christopher rode into the city in silence, watching streetlights pass the window of the black SUV. He checked in under a pseudonym the way he always did when traveling. The suite on the 42nd floor had been booked for 3 nights. The view faced east, toward the airport, toward the sunrise that was still an hour away. He set his laptop on the desk. He laid his suit on the bed. He stood by the window and tried to feel something other than the strange tightness that had been sitting in his chest since the plane crossed the Pacific. Then he went to take a shower, and when he came back out, the door to the suite was open, and a man with white hair was running a vacuum across the carpet, his back turned to the bed. Christopher froze in the doorway of the bathroom with a towel around his waist and water still beating on his shoulders. The vacuum hummed. The man pushing it did not turn around. For a moment, Christopher thought about closing the bathroom door again and waiting for the sound to stop. That would have been the easiest thing. The man would finish, leave, and Christopher would never know. He could have lived the rest of his life never knowing. But something about the shape of the shoulders made him stop. Something about the slight stoop, the way the right hand gripped the handle a little higher than the left, the way the head tilted when the vacuum bumped against the leg of the desk. Christopher had seen those shoulders before. He had seen them bent over a workbench in a garage on Maplewood Drive, sanding a piece of cherry wood for a coffee table that never got finished. He had seen them at the kitchen sink on Sunday mornings, washing dishes while humming along to a transistor radio. He had seen them on a front lawn 20 years ago watching him walk away. "Excuse me," Christopher said. The vacuum kept humming. The man hadn't heard him. "Excuse me," Christopher said again, louder this time. The vacuum clicked off. The man turned around slowly, already beginning the apology that maintenance staff at five-star hotels were trained to deliver when they accidentally entered an occupied suite. "I'm so sorry, sir. The front desk told me the room was vac." The sentence stopped. It didn't trail off. It stopped, the way a clock stops when the spring breaks. Edward Vance stood in the middle of the suite holding the handle of an industrial vacuum cleaner, his mouth half open around a word he would never finish, and stared at his son. Christopher stared back. The first thing he noticed was how small his father had become. Edward had been 6 feet 2 inches when Christopher was a child. The man in front of him now could not have been taller than 5 feet 10. His hair was completely white. The skin around his eyes was thin and creased in a way that suggested he had not slept well in years, possibly decades. He had lost weight. The uniform hung loose on his shoulders. His hands, which Christopher remembered as enormous, the hands of a man who could palm a basketball and lift the back of a car off a flat tire, looked like the hands of someone who had spent too long doing small, careful work in cold rooms. The second thing he noticed was the name tag. Edward stitched in faded blue thread, the V of Vance worn almost smooth. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The air conditioning cycled on somewhere above the ceiling. Outside, the first edge of sunrise began to lighten the eastern sky over Charlotte. Christopher counted the seconds because his mind needed something to do, something to hold on to, some small task that was not the much larger task of accepting what his eyes were telling him. 10 seconds, 15, 20. The number kept climbing. He could feel water sliding down the back of his neck from his hair. He could feel his pulse in his throat. At 40 seconds, Edward finally moved. He let go of the vacuum handle. The handle fell against the carpet with a soft thump. He took a single step backward toward the door, then stopped. He raised both hands halfway, the way a man raises his hands when he is trying to apologize without words. Then he lowered them again. Then he said the only sentence he could think of, the sentence he had apparently been rehearsing in his head for 20 years without ever expecting to deliver it. "I'm sorry." Christopher couldn't speak. The word sorry didn't fit in the room. It was too small for what it was trying to carry. It was a word people used for bumping into someone in a grocery aisle, for forgetting to return a phone call, for arriving 5 minutes late to a meeting. It was not a word for 20 years of silence, for a foreclosed house, for a mother's funeral his son had not been informed about until 3 weeks after the burial. "I'm sorry," Edward said again, quieter. "I'm sorry, son. I'll go. I'll have them send someone else. You won't have to see me again." Edward turned toward the vacuum and began winding the cord around the handle with the careful, practiced motions of a man who had been doing this work for a long time. His hands were trembling. He did not look up. He did not look at his son. He simply wound the cord and tried to make himself as small as the situation required. "Stop," Christopher said. The word came out harder than he intended. Edward stopped immediately, the cord half wound in his hands. "Don't move." Christopher walked back into the bathroom and pulled on the hotel robe hanging on the back of the door. His hands were shaking too. He had not noticed until he tried to tie the belt and the end slipped out of his fingers twice. When he came back into the suite, his father was still standing exactly where he had been, the vacuum cord half wound, his eyes fixed on a point on the carpet about 3 feet in front of his shoes. "Sit down," Christopher said. Edward shook his head once. "I can't. I'm on shift. They check the rooms. If I'm in here too long, they'll think. Sit down." There was something in Christopher's voice that brooked no further argument. It was a tone he had developed in boardrooms over 20 years, a tone that had ended negotiations and started careers. Edward heard it and obeyed without understanding why. He walked over to the small armchair by the window and sat on the edge of it, his back straight, his hands folded in his lap, the way a man sits when he is waiting to be sentenced. Christopher sat on the corner of the bed across from him. For a long moment he could not find a single word that felt adequate. 20 years of imagined conversations crowded into his throat at once and canceled each other out. Every accusation he had rehearsed in the shower over the years, every speech he had drafted on long flights, every cold dismissal he had practiced in front of mirrors, all of it dissolved in the presence of the actual person, who was now smaller than the version Christopher had been carrying in his head, and who was wearing a name tag with their family name stitched on it. "How long have you worked here?" Christopher finally asked. 6 years. 6 years. Yes. At this hotel. Yes. Cleaning rooms, yes. Sometimes the conference floors, sometimes the kitchens. When they're short, they move us around. Christopher's mouth had gone completely dry. He stood up, walked to the minibar, and pulled out a bottle of water. He drank half of it in one swallow. He did not offer one to his father. He could not bring himself to perform that small courtesy, not yet. He sat back down on the corner of the bed. "Where do you live?" "Greensboro. I take the bus." "How long is the bus ride?" "An hour and 40 minutes each way, sometimes longer if there's traffic on I-85. "Why Greensboro?" Edward looked up for the first time. His eyes were the same color Christopher remembered, the same pale gray-blue, but the light behind them was different. It was tired. It was a light that had been turned down low for so many years that Christopher wasn't sure it could come back up. "Because the rent is cheaper than Charlotte," Edward said quietly. "And I didn't want to be anywhere people would recognize me. After everything. After the bankruptcy. After your mother." The mention of his mother landed in the room like a piece of furniture falling through the ceiling. Christopher felt his jaw tighten. He had not said her name out loud in 19 years. Not once. He had not been to her grave. He did not know where she was buried. He had received the news of her death in an email from a cousin he barely remembered 3 weeks after the funeral with a subject line that simply read about your mother. He had read the email at a desk in a parking space in Tanjong Pagar. He had closed his laptop. He had walked outside. He had not cried. He had not cried for 19 years. "Don't," Christopher said. "Don't talk about her yet." "I can't do that yet." Edward nodded slowly. Okay, son." "Don't call me son." Edward flinched. It was a small movement, barely visible, but Christopher saw it. And to his own surprise, he felt something inside himself flinch back. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The sun had risen far enough now that orange light was beginning to push through the gaps in the curtains, painting a thin, bright line across the carpet between them. Christopher watched the line move slowly toward his father's feet. He thought about all the things he had been planning to do today. The breakfast meeting with his head of strategy at 7, the technical rehearsal at 9, the walkthrough with the conference producers at 10:30, the lunch with 2 board members at noon, the keynote at 4,000 people in the audience, industry press, live streams in 12 countries. The most important professional moment of his year, possibly of his decade. He pulled out his phone. He typed a single message to his assistant: "Cancel everything before 3, no exceptions, don't call me." He turned the phone face down on the bedspread. "Tell me what happened," Christopher said. Edward looked confused. "With what?" "With everything, with Vance and Hadley, with the bankruptcy, with the years after. I want the whole thing, from the beginning. I want to know why you let our family lose the house and never once tried to explain yourself. I want to know why I had to find out my mother was dead from an email. I want to know why you never came after me. I want to know why I have to walk into a hotel suite in my own country and find my father vacuuming the carpet at 61 years old." 71, Edward said quietly. "What?" "I'm 71, not 61. Christopher closed his eyes. The math was, of course, correct. He had simply not done it. He had been carrying a version of his father frozen at 51, the age Edward had been when Christopher walked out. Time had kept moving, the way time always does, and Christopher had not been there to notice. Tell me, Christopher said. Edward looked down at his hands. He uncurled the fingers slowly, then curled them back into his lap. He drew a breath. He let it out. When he began to speak, his voice was not the voice Christopher remembered. It was thinner. It moved more slowly. It had the careful packing of a man who had been over the same story in his own head so many times that the words had worn smooth from being turned, but who had never spoken them out loud to anyone. Your mother and I started Vance and Hadley with Gregory Hadley in 1996. You were a baby. We had $38,000 between us, most of it from your mother's father when he passed. We rented a warehouse off Hillsborough Road. Gregory and I had been roommates at NC State. He'd done 2 years at a trucking firm. I'd done 4 years in operations at a paper mill. We thought we knew enough. We thought we were going to build something. I know all this, Christopher said. You know the outside of it. You don't know the inside. Let me get to the inside. Christopher said nothing. By 2002, we had 11 trucks. We had contracts with 3 regional grocery chains. We had 18 employees. We were profitable, not rich, but profitable. Your mother kept the books. Gregory ran the routing. I ran the warehouse and the client relationships. We were good at it. We were actually good at it. Then what? Then in 2003, Gregory came to me with a proposal. He wanted to expand into pharmaceutical logistics, refrigerated trucks, federally regulated chain of custody. He said the margins were 3 times what we were making on grocery. He said he had a contact at a distributor in Atlanta who would give us a pilot contract. He said we needed to invest in the equipment fast before a competitor saw the opening. And you invested. We invested. We took out a line of credit against the warehouse, against my house, against Gregory's house. $2.1 million. We bought the trucks. We hired the drivers. We built the cold storage. We did everything the contract required. And the contract. Edward's hands clenched once, then released. The contract was never real. The room went very still. What do you mean it was never real? I mean the distributor in Atlanta had never heard of us. I mean Gregory had forged the letter of intent. I mean by the time I figured it out, the money was gone. Christopher sat very still on the edge of the bed. His mind was moving in 2 directions at once. Part of it was listening to his father, processing each sentence as it arrived, fitting it against memories of 1996 and 2003, and the foreclosure notice he had read at the kitchen table when he was 17. The other part of it was somewhere else entirely. The other part was running search queries it had not yet been asked to run. Say that again, Christopher said. The contract wasn't real. Gregory had, no, the part about where the money went. Edward looked down at his hands. I don't know exactly. I never could prove it. I tried. I hired a lawyer with the last money your mother and I had. He chased it for 9 months. He found about 400,000 of it sitting in a Delaware shell company. The rest was gone. Wire transfers to Cayman accounts, then to other accounts, then nothing. The lawyer said it would cost 200,000 more to follow it, and even then he couldn't promise anything. We didn't have 200,000 more. We didn't have 200 more. Why didn't you go to the police? I did. And the police told me it was a civil matter. They said it looked like a business dispute between partners. They said Gregory had documents showing I had signed off on the wire transfers, which I had. I had signed off on transfers I thought were going to legitimate vendors. Gregory had set up fake invoices with real-looking letterheads. The forensic accountant said it was sophisticated. He used that word, sophisticated, like it was a compliment. He said whoever set it up knew exactly what they were doing. What happened to Gregory? Gregory declared personal bankruptcy 6 months after I did. He moved to Charlotte. He told everyone the partnership had failed because of my mismanagement. He said I was a drinker. I'm not a drinker, Christopher. I've never been a drinker. But he told people I was, and people believed him because he was the one still smiling at the country club and I was the one whose house had a padlock on the door. Christopher stood up. He walked to the desk where his laptop was sitting. He flipped it open. He did not look at his father. He typed Gregory Hadley into a search bar. The first result loaded. The second. The third. Gregory Hadley, Christopher said, founder and CEO of Meridian Freight Solutions. Headquartered in Charlotte, 2,400 employees. Annual revenue $890 million. IPO scheduled for the second quarter of this year. Edward looked up. What? You didn't know? I knew he'd done well. I didn't know how well. I don't read the business pages, son. I haven't read the business pages in 20 years. He's on the board of 3 industry associations. He gives $250,000 a year to UNC Charlotte. He's been featured in Forbes twice. He has a foundation. Christopher. He has a foundation, Dad. He has a foundation in his own name that funds entrepreneurship programs for first-generation college students. The website says he's a strong believer in second chances. The word Dad had slipped out before Christopher could stop it. Edward heard it. So did Christopher. Neither of them mentioned it. Christopher stared at the screen. Meridian Freight Solutions had been Christopher's largest competitor in the North American payments and logistics integration market for 6 years. Christopher's company processed payment rails for trucking fleets across 37 countries. Meridian had been building a competing rail since 2019. They had taken contracts from him in Texas, in Ohio, in Tennessee. They had outbid him on a Walmart pilot last year. Christopher had spent dozens of board meetings discussing Gregory Hadley by name. Christopher had shaken Gregory Hadley's hand at a conference in Miami in 2023. He had thought the name was a coincidence. The world was full of Hadleys. He had not made the connection. He had not made the connection because he had not allowed himself to think about Vance and Hadley Logistics for 19 years. Dad, Christopher said. The word came easier this time, though it still felt like a stone in his mouth. Do you still have any of the documents from back then? Edward looked uncertain. Some in a shoebox at home. A shoebox, a Florsheim box, brown, it's under the bed in the spare room. I kept everything the lawyer gave me. I didn't know why, I just couldn't throw it away. Christopher closed the laptop. He stood up. He paced to the window, then back. He looked at the clock on the nightstand. It was 6:43 in the morning. The keynote was at 4. He had 9 hours and 17 minutes. How far is Greensboro from here by car? An hour and a half, maybe. Less if traffic is light. Get up. Christopher, I have a shift. I can't just... I'm going to call the general manager of this hotel in 45 seconds and explain that the man who has been vacuuming carpets here for 6 years is my father, and that there has been a clerical error in your employment file, and that you will not be returning today, and that he should consider this your 2 weeks' notice with full severance. Then I'm going to call my driver and we are going to Greensboro. Then we are coming back. Then I am going to walk on a stage at 4 o'clock in front of 4,000 people, and I am going to do something I have not yet decided. But before any of that happens, you are going to get up out of that chair and you are going to come with me, because I have spent 20 years believing something about you that may not have been true, and I need to know which version of my life I have actually been living. Edward did not move for a moment. Then his eyes filled with water. He did not let the tears fall. He simply sat with the water in his eyes and looked at his son, and Christopher could see him calculating whether this was real, whether he could trust it, whether this was the kind of moment that would be taken back in an hour or a day or a week. Christopher recognized the calculation. He had done it himself many times in boardrooms with investors, with women, with anyone who offered him something that seemed too good to be true. Okay, Edward said finally. Okay, son, I'll come. Christopher dressed in 5 minutes. He did not bother with the suit. He put on jeans and a sweater and the leather jacket he traveled in. He did not bother with the assistant or the strategist or the board members. He typed 3 messages on his phone and did not wait for the replies. The driver pulled up in front of the Westmark at 6:59. Christopher walked Edward through the lobby with one hand on his father's elbow, the way a son might walk an elderly parent through a crowded room, except that Edward was still wearing the gray maintenance uniform, and the woman at the concierge desk looked at the two of them with an expression Christopher chose not to interpret. They did not speak much in the car. Edward sat in the front passenger seat at his own insistence. He said he could not sit in the back, that the back was for people who paid him to drive them, that he had spent 6 years cleaning the rooms of people who sat in backs of cars, and he could not bring himself to do it. Christopher sat in the back alone. He watched the highway unfurl through the window. He thought about Gregory Hadley. He thought about the handshake in Miami. He thought about the times Gregory's company had outmaneuvered his own, and the way he had taken it personally, the way he had told his executive team that there was something about Meridian that he could not name, something that made him want to win against them more than against any other competitor, something that felt almost like a grudge he could not locate. He had located it now. The house in Greensboro was a small ranch on a quiet street. The paint on the trim was peeling. The grass needed cutting. The front steps had a crack that ran from the top tread to the concrete walkway below. Edward fumbled with the key. The door opened into a hallway that smelled faintly of old coffee and dryer sheets. There were no photographs on the walls. There was no furniture in the living room except a single recliner and a small television on a metal stand. "This way," Edward said. The spare room was small and almost empty. A twin bed with a thin quilt. A nightstand with a Bible on it that did not look red. A closet with 3 shirts on hangers. Edward got down on his knees beside the bed, slowly, the way a man with bad knees lowers himself toward the floor when he has done it 1,000 times and learned which joints to favor. He reached under the bed and pulled out a brown Florsheim shoebox tied shut with a piece of green twine. He set it on the bed. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he untied the twine and lifted the lid. Inside were papers, hundreds of papers, folded and refolded, the edges soft from handling, bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, letters from lawyers on letterheads from law firms that had since merged or dissolved, a spiral notebook with Edward's handwriting filling every page in pencil that had been pressed hard into the paper, a manila envelope marked Gregory in block letters, a second envelope marked police report, a third envelope marked Lawyer 9 MONTHS. Christopher sat down on the edge of the bed. His hands were not quite steady. "You kept all of this." "I couldn't throw it away. I didn't know why. I just couldn't." Christopher began to read. He read for an hour without speaking. Edward sat in a small wooden chair in the corner of the room and watched him. Once, Edward got up and went to the kitchen and came back with 2 cups of instant coffee and a plate of saltine crackers because there was nothing else in the house. Christopher drank the coffee. He did not eat the crackers. He kept reading. The story emerged in pieces, but the pieces fit together with the clean, devastating logic of something that had actually happened. There was a letter of intent from a pharmaceutical distributor in Atlanta, dated April 2003, signed by a man named Robert Carmichael, on letterhead from a company called Piedmont Pharma Distribution. Christopher pulled out his phone and ran a search. Piedmont Pharma Distribution had never existed. No such company had ever been registered in the state of Georgia. Robert Carmichael was not a person who could be located in any pharmaceutical industry database. The letterhead, examined closely, used a font that had not been released by Adobe until 2014. "You didn't know to check the font," Christopher said. "I didn't know what a font was, son. I'm not making excuses. I just didn't." There were wire transfer records from Vance and Hadley Logistics to a vendor called Triangle Cold Chain Equipment. Triangle Cold Chain Equipment had been incorporated in Delaware in February 2003, 2 months before the wire transfers began. Its sole listed officer was a name Christopher did not recognize, a Carolyn Pemberton with an address that traced to a UPS mailbox in Wilmington. By August 2003, Triangle Cold Chain Equipment had received $1.7 million from Vance and Hadley. By October, it had been dissolved. Christopher pulled up Meridian Freight Solutions S1 filing, the public document the company had filed with the SEC ahead of its planned IPO. The S1 listed Gregory Hadley's professional history. It described his time at Vance and Hadley as a brief, unsuccessful partnership in regional logistics that had ended in mutual dissolution due to market conditions in 2003. It did not mention bankruptcy. It did not mention Edward by name. It did not mention pharmaceutical logistics. It did not mention the $1.7 million. The S1 also listed Gregory's early personal investments. Among them was a 2004 investment of $900,000 in a startup called Carolina Cold LLC, which had become the technical foundation of Meridian's refrigerated freight division. Carolina Cold LLC's incorporation documents listed the same Carolyn Pemberton at the same UPS mailbox in Wilmington as its registered agent. Christopher set down the laptop. "Dad," he said. "Yes, son. He used the money from your bankruptcy to start the company that became Meridian. I always thought he did. I never could prove it. It's in the S1, Dad. He put it in the S1 himself. He hid it inside a corporate history, but it's there. The shell company that took the wire transfers from your business is the same shell company that registered the LLC he used to start the cold chain operation that became Meridian's refrigerated freight division." Edward did not say anything. He simply sat in the wooden chair with his hands in his lap and looked at his son, and Christopher could see something passing across his face that Christopher could not at first identify. It was not vindication. It was not anger. It was not even grief. It was something quieter and stranger. It looked like a man hearing the answer to a question he had stopped asking so long ago that he had forgotten the question still existed somewhere inside him, waiting. "I'm going to call my lawyer," Christopher said. "Okay. And then I'm going to call a friend of mine at the SEC. Her name is Priya. She runs enforcement out of the Atlanta office. I met her at a conference in Davos 3 years ago. She's good. She's very good. Okay. And then we're going to drive back to Charlotte and I'm going to deliver a different keynote than the one I prepared." Edward looked up. "Christopher, you don't have to do this on a stage. You can do it through lawyers. You don't have to make it public." "I know I don't have to." "Then why?" Christopher thought about that for a moment. He looked around the small bare room, the Bible, the thin quilt, the peeling paint on the trim. He thought about a 71-year-old man taking a bus an hour and 40 minutes each way to vacuum the carpets of executives who never noticed him. He thought about a foundation in Charlotte that funded entrepreneurship programs for first-generation college students in the name of the man who had destroyed his father. "Because he gave a speech last year," Christopher said. "Gregory, at the same conference. He gave a speech about integrity in logistics leadership. I watched it on the flight here. I watched it twice. I thought it was a good speech. He's a good speaker. He has this thing he does where he pauses before the important word in a sentence, and you find yourself leaning toward the screen. He told a story about a partner he had in his 20s who couldn't handle the pressure of business and let the company collapse, and he said it taught him that leaders have to be willing to carry weight that other people can't carry. The audience clapped, Dad. They gave him a standing ovation. He was talking about you and they gave him a standing ovation and I clapped too because I didn't know." Edward closed his eyes. "I can't undo that I clapped," Christopher said, "but I can do this. I can stand on the same stage in front of the same kind of audience and I can tell the truth. And the truth, when it's said in the right room at the right time, is harder to bury than a lawsuit." Edward opened his eyes. They were wet. He did not wipe them. "I'm sorry, son. You said that already. I'm going to keep saying it for as long as you'll let me." Christopher looked at his father. The anger that had lived in him for 20 years was still there. He could feel it. It had not dissolved, it had not been replaced, but it had moved. It had moved from one address to another. It was no longer the central tenet of his chest. Something else was beginning to occupy that space, something he did not yet have a name for, something that felt like grief and relief and exhaustion arriving all at once. "We have to go," Christopher said. "I have a phone call to make from the car, and then I have a stage to walk onto." They drove back to Charlotte. Christopher made the calls. His lawyer answered on the second ring. Priya at the SEC answered on the fourth. Christopher walked them both through what he had found, sentence by sentence, document by document. His lawyer said the words prima facie and materially false statements in a registration filing, and we should move fast. Priya said less. Priya simply asked Christopher to send her the documents in an encrypted folder before noon, and to please not discuss the matter publicly until her team had reviewed it. Christopher hung up. He looked out the window at the highway. He looked at the back of his father's head in the front passenger seat. He took a breath. He picked up his phone again. He typed a message to his head of communications. "I'm rewriting the keynote. Send me the teleprompter feed. I'll bring my own remarks." They reached the Westmark at 12:40. Christopher took his father up to the suite. He had a hotel garment bag waiting at the door, a suit he kept his father from declining by simply hanging it in the closet and pointing at it. "Wear it," Christopher said. "Or don't, but it's there." "Why? Because you're going to sit in the front row." "Christopher, no. You're going to sit in the front row, Dad. If I'm going to say what I'm going to say, I need to be able to see you while I say it. Otherwise, I'm going to lose my nerve." Edward did not argue. He sat down on the edge of the bed in his gray maintenance uniform and stared at the suit hanging in the closet as though it were a doorway into a country he had not visited in 20 years and was not sure he had a passport for. Christopher left him there. He went into the second bedroom of the suite and sat down at the desk with a yellow legal pad. He wrote for 2 hours. He did not draft. He simply wrote. The words came in the order they needed to come. At 3:30 he changed into his own suit. He knotted his tie in the mirror. When he came out of the bathroom, his father was standing in the living area of the suite wearing the suit Christopher had bought him. It fit better than Christopher had any right to expect. Edward had not put on a tie. Edward did not remember how, he said. Christopher tied it for him. Neither of them spoke during the tying. When Christopher finished and stepped back, his father reached up and touched the knot once with 2 fingers, the way a man touches something he has not felt against his throat in a very long time. "You look good, Dad." "I look like a man pretending." "Maybe, but you also look good." The walk through the conference center was strange. Christopher's team had been calling him for hours. His head of communications, Leela, intercepted him in the back corridor with the kind of expression people wear when they have been managing a crisis that has not yet been explained to them. He told her, in 20 seconds, the bare outline. He told her his father would be sitting in the front row. He told her that the prepared keynote was no longer being used. He told her to trust him. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Okay." Then she said, "I hope you know what you're doing." Then she walked them both to the green room. At 3:58, Christopher kissed his father on the forehead, which surprised them both, and then he walked through the side door of the green room into the wings of the main stage, where a producer with a headset counted him down from 10. The auditorium beyond the curtain was enormous. 4,000 seats. The lights were already low. The music was already swelling. The producer pointed at him. He walked out. He did not look at the teleprompter. He did not need to. He walked to the center mark on the stage and waited for the applause to finish, and then he waited a few seconds longer until the room understood that he was not going to begin until they were entirely quiet. He looked for his father in the front row. Edward was there in the suit, hands folded in his lap, looking up at the stage with an expression Christopher could not quite read from that distance but could feel from that distance, which was more than enough. "My name is Christopher Vance," he began. "I run a company some of you compete with and some of you partner with. I was supposed to give you a speech today about the future of cross-border payment infrastructure. I'm not going to give you that speech." The room rustled, the small involuntary movement of 4,000 people adjusting their attention. "I'm going to tell you a story instead. It's a story about my father, who is sitting in the front row of this auditorium right now. He is 71 years old. Until 8 hours ago, he was an employee of the hotel attached to this conference center. He has been cleaning the rooms in that hotel for 6 years. I walked into my suite at 6:14 this morning and found him vacuuming the carpet. The silence in the room changed temperature. I had not seen him in 20 years. He told them everything. He told them about Vance and Hadley Logistics in 1996. He told them about the pharmaceutical contract that had never existed. He told them about Piedmont Pharma Distribution and Robert Carmichael and the font that had not been released until 2014. He told them about Triangle Cold Chain Equipment and the UPS mailbox in Wilmington. He told them about Carolina Cold LLC and the shell company that appeared on page 114 of a publicly filed S1 that nobody in this room had read carefully enough. He told them the name of the man who had filed it. He did not raise his voice. He did not use the word liar. He used the word documents. He used the word records. He used the word traceable. He said that he had spent the morning with his lawyer and with a senior enforcement official at the SEC. He said that the matter was now in their hands and that he would not be answering questions about it from the press because he did not want to interfere with a process that had professionals far more qualified than him to conduct it. Then he stopped talking about Gregory Hadley. He did not need to keep talking about Gregory Hadley. The room had already understood. He talked about his father instead. He talked about the man in the front row who had carried a shoebox full of paper under his bed in a small rented house in Greensboro for 2 decades, who had taken a bus an hour and 40 minutes each way to clean carpets so he could pay rent without asking anyone for help, who had never written his son a single letter pleading his case because he had decided somewhere along the way that his son's anger was his to deserve and that defending himself would only make it worse. "I want to tell you what I learned this morning," Christopher said. "I learned that I have spent 20 years being right about the wrong thing. I was right that something broke our family. I was wrong about who broke it, and I was wrong because I never asked. I never asked, because asking required me to consider that the story I had built my entire adult life around might not be the true story, and I would rather have built an empire on a lie I already understood than ask one question that might force me to start over." He paused. He looked at his father. Edward was crying very quietly in the front row, his hands still folded in his lap. "If there is anyone in this room," Christopher said, "who has not spoken to a parent or a child or a sibling in years because of something you are certain you understand, I would like to ask you to do one thing this week. Ask, just ask. You may be right, you may be wrong, but you will know. And knowing, even when it hurts, is the only foundation any of us can actually build on." He thanked them. He walked off the stage. He did not wait for the applause, which was loud and confused and unlike any applause he had ever received, because the room did not quite know whether it had been given a keynote or a confession or a courtroom argument or a eulogy, and the truth was that it had been given all four. By Friday afternoon, Meridian Freight Solutions had postponed its IPO. By Monday, the SEC had issued a formal request for documents. By the end of the month, Gregory Hadley had stepped down as CEO pending the investigation. The federal case would take 2 years to resolve. It would not return the money. It would not return Christopher's mother. It would not return the 20 years. But Edward did not go back to the Westmark. Edward went instead to the offices of a small foundation that Christopher quietly funded that summer, a foundation that paid for legal aid and forensic accounting for families who had lost businesses to partners they had trusted. Edward was its chair. He worked 4 days a week. He answered every letter the foundation received personally, in pencil, on yellow paper. Christopher visited every month. Sometimes they talked about the past. Sometimes they didn't. They were learning, slowly, what a father and son could be to each other after 20 years of silence and 1 morning of truth. And if this story made you think of someone you've been silent with too long, take that as a sign. Ask the question. Make the call. Share your story below. We'd love to hear it.